What's going on, guys? Welcome back into the channel. In today's video, I have an interesting topic of discussion and something we're going to try to test out a little bit in the video. And that is a couple of assertions that I've seen people make in the comments or online whenever talking about player regression in MLB The Show. I've maintained for a long time that it is a very dynamic system, and I'm not saying that these people are disagreeing with that fact. I think there are definitely multiple factors that go into play, but I would like to learn more in today's video and today's experimentation to see if some of these things have any validity. So the first assertion that I've seen thrown around quite a bit is that the age 34 season is when you really start to notice players fall off a cliff in MLB The Show. And I do believe that this one is true based on what I've seen and what I've experienced. So I definitely want to keep an eye out on that today in today's video. But in addition to that, I've also seen people throw around the idea that 10 years of service time is whenever players really start to regress. So what I've done here in today's video is I've gone ahead and started a franchise as the Dodgers, because the Dodgers actually have quite a few players that fall into these categories. Players like Freddie Freeman that are 32 years old and have hit 11 years of service time. So he's really starting to get into that regression range. And first and foremost, before we really jump into anything, I want to show you guys exactly how to view service time so that we know exactly what we're looking at. Viewing service time might be a little bit confusing for some people, and so to tell you exactly where service time is, again, you're going to go to your roster, you're going to hover over whatever player you want to look at their service time for, press triangle, and then you're going to look at that top grouping of categories right there that shows the player's potential, overall, secondary position, and then it lists MLB service time, and it lists a number above that next to their bat hand and right above their weight. So that is going to say how much service time they have in years in the MLB. So Clayton Kershaw, for example, will be another interesting example to test out, who has 13.105 years of service time. So he's above that 10 years of service time that we talked about before, and he's also at that 34-year-old age range. So it'll be interesting to test these things out with the players that we have available. Well, let's go ahead and get a look at what players we have that are going to be an interesting test subject in today's video. So first and foremost, we already talked about Clayton Kershaw. We're going to be skipping over a lot of players in this video because guys that are 27, 25 years old, they're not going to regress. We also have starting pitcher Danny Duffy, who is an 80 overall, 33 years old. So he's just before that 34-year-old threshold, and he's just over the 10 years of MLB service time threshold at 10.085. So we're going to make sure we get him on the MLB roster. He'll be an interesting test subject. In addition, we have Andrew Heaney, who is potentially another interesting test subject, who is a little bit further down the list in terms of overall. He has hit that 30-year-old mark that I have talked about in the past, but he's only a 73 overall, like I said, with C potential, and he has only hit 6.125 years, or sorry, 6.15 years of service time. So a lot of good pitchers to look at in this test today. Then quickly moving on to the bullpen, we actually have a lot of interesting candidates in this video as well. We have Blake Treinen, who is 33 years old and 84 overall and has not hit 10 years of service time. So again, some of these guys are going to be interesting test subjects because I've preached that once they get into their 30s, they start to regress. So if my theory holds true, this type of a player would regress. So would a lot of these other relief pitchers that are, again, 77 overall, 7 years of service time, but he's 33 years old. 32 years old for Scott Alexander, but only 5 years of MLB service time. Jimmy Nelson, 32 years old, but only 7 years of service time. So those are going to be interesting players to look at. Daniel Hudson, 35, 11 years. He should probably regress pretty hard. And David Price, 36 years old, 11 years of service time. He should probably regress hard as well. They also have Craig Kimbrel, who is 33 and at 10 years of service time. And then we're really just going to look at some of the top players at other positions. They also have Freddie Freeman, who's 32 years old and 11 years of service time. Max Muncy, who's 31 but only 5 years of service time. Top players on the team. Second baseman Chris Taylor is 31 years old with 6 years of service time. And like I said, this is really a great example of a team to look at because they have these types of players all over the field. Justin Turner at third base being 37 years old. I would expect him to fall off tremendously. Okay, and we've now officially simulated the entire season, finishing the season at 105 and 57. I believe the best record in the entire league. So I feel like that's actually going to give us a good look at what we're trying to determine in today's video, because that means that a lot of players on our team had really good performances. That means that our team performed really well, and so any numbers that we see negative are generally speaking going to be a result of straight up regression and not necessarily a result of poor performance. Obviously, we'll look for those specific cases to see if any player played particularly poorly and that resulted in regression on their ratings, but nonetheless, let's go ahead now and dive into all of those players that we were talking about before. The first and very interesting example is going to be Clayton Kershaw here, who did play really well on the season. A 3.27 ERA, a winning record, 34 years old, and a 93 overall. Now, clearly, he's got really high potential, so that could potentially influence his ability to stick around his rating. He also played well. So when we take a look at his stats, despite his amazing performance, he still did get a couple of negatives. He has negatives to stamina and BB per 9. He has a couple of positives as well, though, so I would consider that pretty stagnant, all things considered. So even though he's 34 years old and he is past the 10 years of MLB service time, he did not necessarily go down. It is very possible, though, like I said, that things are balanced out here by his positive performance. Next up, we have Danny Duffy here, who is 33 years old and 82 overall now, and that's an increase from where we started. So he is now an 82 overall. He went up, didn't get any negatives on his player card here, which is actually pretty impressive as a 33-year-old with 10 plus years of service time. We were also taking a look at Andrew Heaney here. Andrew Heaney again got a bunch of negatives and only a couple of positives. So this is one of those natural regressions here, and from a statistical perspective, he actually played pretty well this season. 7 wins, 6 losses, and a 3.41 ERA. That's really respectable for a 74 overall player. Technically speaking, it's saying that his overall went up, and that's likely because he's getting that home run per 9, K per 9, and H per 9 stat up, and so his other negatives to, pitching clutch, control, fielding, accuracy, and stamina are not necessarily outweighing that, but when you look at the pluses and minuses, he got +5 and he's getting a total of -5. So another stagnant player here. Nonetheless, you are seeing quite a few negatives from a player that is only 30 years old and has not reached 10 years of service time. And as I go through these players, I do apologize if I am missing anybody that was present at the beginning of the video. It is very possible that my team auto-traded. I did have everything set to auto so I could get through the season as quickly as possible on the simulation, but nonetheless, let's go ahead and take a look at this bullpen. Blake Treinen was an example that we wanted to look at. He is 33 years old, has not reached 10 years of service time, and from a performance aspect, actually played really well. 43 saves this season and a 2.31 ERA. He has dropped significantly in his ratings, though. So he's gotten negatives in just about every category. If we total that up, that's over 20 negatives in total ratings for this player. He hasn't hit that 34-year-old threshold, and he has not hit 10 years of MLB service time. So this might be our prime example of what I traditionally see in franchise mode is players that have hit 30 plus years old, and I've never really paid too much attention to service time. He's not at 10 years. He is still getting massive negatives to all of his ratings across the board. Then again, the rest of our relief pitchers were pretty similar situations in terms of their MLB service time and age. We're getting positives to Jimmy Nelson, actually, at 32 years old and a 78 overall. Scott Alexander is getting mostly positives, even though he's 32 years old and a 6 MLB service time. Shane Green is getting a mixture, mostly positives actually, on his overall, and he's 33 years old with 7 years of MLB service time. And I believe we also took a look at Daniel Hudson, if I'm not mistaken, at the beginning of the video, who has dropped significantly, getting a bunch of negatives, 35 years old, 12 years of MLB service time. We may not have looked at him at the beginning, but again, this is another example of a player that's getting up there in the 30s and is hitting a lot of regression. Then we also took a look at Craig Kimbrel, our closing pitcher, who is again a player that got a couple of positives and only one negative. His overall actually increased going from the beginning of the season to the end of the season. This one is incredibly interesting because his performance was really not that great. A 5.75 ERA, a 2-6 record, and yet his overall went up. So I think one of the things that we can conclude from the very beginning is that this is not totally performance-based. That is absolutely for certain. Now, if you have a bad performance, I think that in my experience, you're generally more likely to experience regression. You're more likely to see what you see with Blake Treinen, but again, this is a player that played really well in the season in comparison to a player like Craig Kimbrel. So it's really interesting to see the contrast here, but what I'm also seeing so far is that there is no relation between 10 years of service time and regression or the age of 34. It seems like there might be a mild correlation between the later 30s and regressing harder, but specifically the age of 34 I have not noticed. We will continue the simulation further, and this will be a little bit of a longer video, but let's go ahead and look at a few of the other players that we mentioned. We looked at Freddie Freeman, who is still getting a mixture of positives and negatives. He's getting actually more positives, taking him up in overall, and a 32-year age, 12 years of service time. And then we have Max Muncy, who is getting quite a few negatives, actually. I'm surprised his overall didn't go down with what I'm seeing there, but probably because of his power, he's maintaining that rating. He is only 31 years old and 6 years of service time, and he's getting more negatives than anything else. So again, I feel like to this point we can conclude that there's not that strong of a correlation between 10 years of service time and a player's regression. And again, I think that it's really just kind of dynamic whenever you hit the age of 30, which is the regression age within the game, that you'll start to take more and more regression depending on these various different factors. We can also take a look at Chris Taylor, who we had mentioned, who is getting a large number of negatives, but he's getting some positives in his power on both sides, so that's actually taking his overall up as a whole. 7 years of service time and 31 years of age, does not meet the 34-year requirement, does not meet the 10 years of MLB service time, but you can still see all of those negatives across the board in comparison to where he began. As expected, Justin Turner faced a massive amount of regression, being 37 years old, despite the fact that he has a potential. So we've seen now players that are 34, 35 years old not necessarily take a massive amount of regression, but it really seems like 34 years old is not necessarily the age. It might actually be closer to 35, 36, or 37 is whenever players truly hit that fall off a cliff measurement and really can't keep their rating up within MLB The Show. So that's certainly something to think about here, is that might be one of the shifts in the way we're thinking about regression. One of my theories for quite a while with MLB The Show is that if you have a potential, your regression is going to hit later. And I don't know exactly how the system works behind the scenes, but it really seems like if you have a potential, your regression arc ends up later in the years, so later into the 30s. Whereas if you have B potential, you're more likely to hit your regression in those low 30 numbers. And if you have C potential, but is kind of contradicted by these guys in the bullpen here, like Jimmy Nelson, Scott Alexander, and Shane Green, who really didn't regress that much, you're more likely to regress in those early 30s as well. Now, clearly that's not the case with those guys. We also have a B potential here that's 35 years old getting major regression. So it's kind of a mixed bag of what's going on here. There's not really one hard and fast rule saying, yeah, at 10 years of service time, this guy's going to fall off. At 34 years old, this guy's going to fall off. That's just simply not the case, as seen with this simple test. Now, one further test that I did want to do was I wanted to simulate to the offseason. So once these players turn to the next year of age, see what happens to those players. Well, it's actually quite interesting. Freddie Freeman, not much happened. He actually went up in overall, and I think that that's consistent with what we saw before. Mookie Betts, however, turning over from 29 years old, who had no regression on his player card before, turning to 30 years old, took a lot of negatives in a lot of categories across the board. Now, he does have those positives to his contact and his power versus right, but he is only, again, at 8 years of MLB service time, and the only thing that changed here was he ticked over to 30 years old. So really what the factor is a little bit of randomness, a combination of various different factors, but above all else, once you hit 30 years old, you're at risk of regression. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what your service time is. You can bat .323 with 34 home runs, and you can still face quite a bit of negatives across the board with your player. That is the most consistent thing that I've seen in MLB The Show through the years that I've played. I know I'm not the most experienced player in MLB The Show. I'm certainly not the most experienced baseball mind out there, but nonetheless, this is something that I've noticed consistently across the board with players when they hit the age of 30 and those low 30s, they do start to take on regression. I'm not saying that they're going to fall off a hill, because clearly Mookie Betts hasn't fallen off the hill. Clearly Max Muncy isn't falling off the hill yet. But, you know, whenever you start to hit those higher 30s, you may start to fall off, like we saw with a couple of our players as we were going through. Blake Treinen is a good example of this. He's 34 now, and he's regressed quite significantly. And then we were also talking about our third baseman, Justin Turner, who regressed tremendously whenever he hit the age of 38, and at 37 years old, that's just to be expected. So it's going to depend on your players overall. It's going to depend on their existing potential. It's going to depend heavily on their age, and maybe service time is a factor here, but I really didn't see any correlation. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there is some evidence to that. I couldn't find anything online stating that the developers made service time a factor in regression or development or anything like that. It makes sense that it should be a factor, but from what I've experienced, I just haven't seen that, and I haven't seen any evidence of it online either. So nonetheless, thank you for sticking with me through this testing video and this discussion. Certainly leave your comments down in the comment section below. Clearly, I can look at one thing one way and somebody else can look at something another way. So if you look at this video and you look at this testing and you see it a different way than I do, leave that in the comment section below and we can have a chat about it. I'm certainly very curious to hear your thoughts on these types of things, especially if you've done testing of your own, and I could certainly do more extensive testing than this, but this really just is consistent with what I've seen for years with MLB The Show. So nonetheless, I do hope that this was at least informative to whoever watched this video. If you did enjoy it or found it informative, leave a like down below, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you guys in the next video, and I hope you have a good one.